The tornado sirens began at 6:17 p.m. on May 3, 1999, echoing across the wheat fields and two-lane highways of Bristow, Oklahoma. The sound was both familiar and terrifying, a mechanical wail that signaled not just weather but the possibility of endings. Inside the small red brick building of Bristow High School, English teacher Laura Jennings was finishing the last stack of essays on her desk, her red pen bleeding through the pages like tiny wounds. Outside, the sky had turned the greenish hue that Oklahomans learned to fear early in life, a sickly color that meant rotation, pressure, the convergence of heat and fury. Students had been dismissed hours earlier as warnings grew more urgent, and the hallways that usually buzzed with after-school noise now felt cavernous and abandoned. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Laura looked at the clock, 6:19, and told herself she had time to drive home before the storm reached Creek County. Her house sat just 7 miles east, a modest one-story with a detached garage and a backyard shelter built by her father in 1978 after the Sapulpa twister destroyed 3 neighborhoods. She had always joked that her father's paranoia had turned out to be good planning, but as she gathered her papers and slipped them into her worn leather satchel, she couldn't shake the uneasy thought that maybe he had known something she didn't. By the time she stepped outside, the wind had already begun to change direction. Leaves skittered across the parking lot in spirals. The air felt heavy, as if it were waiting. At 6:26, Laura's neighbor, Carl Henson, saw her blue Chevy Cavalier pull into her driveway. He watched from his porch as she got out, holding her papers against the wind. The sirens wailed again, louder this time, and Carl shouted across the yard, offering her space in his larger underground shelter. Laura smiled, shouted something he couldn't hear, and pointed toward her own backyard. She unlocked the heavy steel door set into the ground, propped it open with a cinder block, and descended the concrete steps carrying a flashlight and her satchel. Carl turned back toward his own shelter as the wind picked up, the kind that pressed trees flat and sent dust into every crevice of the world. Within minutes, the sky turned nearly black, lightning flickering horizontally through the clouds like veins. By 6:34, the tornado sirens were continuous. Television meteorologists later called it the most powerful supercell of the decade, the one that would spawn multiple twisters across central Oklahoma, leveling homes and entire families in minutes. When the wind subsided and the air fell eerily still, Carl climbed from his shelter expecting to see debris, maybe downed power lines. Instead, he found his yard untouched. The oak trees stood firm, his truck unmoved. He looked across the street toward Laura's house and felt the first cold edge of something he couldn't name. The steel hatch of her shelter was closed tight, the cinder block gone, the lock snapped into place as if sealed from the outside. He called her name, his voice strange in the quiet. When she didn't answer, he assumed she was still waiting out aftershocks, maybe frightened, maybe praying. He knocked once, twice, then went home to call her landline. The phone rang and rang, echoing faintly from her living room through an open window. By morning, power had returned to most of Bristow. News stations reported the destruction further south, more Midwest City, Bridge Creek, names that would live in Oklahoma's collective memory. But Bristow had been spared, and the local police chief, Richard Hale, spent his morning checking on elderly residents and minor property damage. At 8:12 a.m., Carl Henson called the sheriff's office to report that his neighbor's tornado shelter was locked, sealed, and silent. Deputy Ellen Burke arrived 15 minutes later. She'd known Laura for years. They'd gone to high school together, shared coffee occasionally at Maggie's diner. Burke expected to find her shaken but safe, maybe embarrassed at having been locked in accidentally. But when she knelt beside the steel door, she felt the hairs on her arms rise. The lock was intact, new-looking, and clean. There was no dirt in the hinge, no mud on the handle, as if it had been scrubbed. The air vent, a narrow pipe extending from the ground a few feet away, was capped with wire mesh that had been soldered shut. The deputy called for backup. At 8:42, Sheriff Hale arrived with a crowbar and bolt cutters. He inserted the tool beneath the padlock, twisted, and felt it snap easily. Together they heaved open the steel hatch, expecting the stale, damp smell of earth. Instead, a faint chemical odor drifted out, sharp and sterile, like hospital disinfectant. Burke switched on her flashlight and descended slowly. The concrete steps were dry, spotless. The floor of the shelter gleamed faintly in the beam of light, and her first irrational thought was that someone had polished it. There was no dust, no debris, not even footprints. The flashlight's beam caught faint white streaks on the floor, chalk lines, drawn in curved patterns that resembled handwriting but made no sense. At the far end of the shelter lay Laura's satchel, neatly placed against the wall. Her flashlight sat beside it, batteries still working. The essays were stacked inside the bag, untouched. There was no sign of Laura Jennings. No clothing, no hair, no blood, no disturbance. The shelter was sealed, the lock unbroken, the air vent soldered, and yet the woman who had entered less than 14 hours earlier had vanished without trace. By noon, the scene had attracted a handful of officers and 2 reporters from Tulsa who'd driven down chasing storm damage. One of them, a young man named Brian Ellsworth, captured photographs that would later appear on local news: the pristine shelter floor, the chalk patterns, the sheriff standing at the entrance, bewildered. The photographs would become legend in online forums years later, feeding theories of paranormal abduction, government experiments, and time anomalies. But for those who stood there that morning, the mystery was painfully human. The town knew Laura Jennings, 32 years old, single, methodical, a teacher who brought extra pencils for students who forgot theirs. The kind of woman who made lists for everything, whose refrigerator calendar was filled 3 months ahead. People like her didn't just vanish. Detective Roger Callahan, who'd transferred from Tulsa PD the previous year, was assigned to the case by afternoon. He found the entire scene maddening in its perfection. Crime scenes were supposed to be messy. Even suicides left residue, a trace of pain. But this? It was as if someone had erased her. The chalk markings, when analyzed, turned out to be calcium carbonate mixed with trace magnesium, ordinary classroom chalk. The curves and loops on the floor matched no known language or pattern, though one partial shape resembled the cursive letter L. Forensic teams took plaster molds of the floor, swabbed the walls for biological residue, and collected air samples that later revealed only trace amounts of cleaning solvent, ammonium chloride, the kind used in industrial janitorial products. There were no fingerprints on the hatch handle except those of Sheriff Hale and Deputy Burke. No footprints on the steps. The concrete floor's smooth surface reflected the beams of flashlights. Like glass. When Callahan visited the school to examine Laura's classroom, he found her chalkboard still covered in notes from Monday's lesson, Macbeth, Act 5. She'd written in her distinct, looping script, "Nothing in his life became him like believing it." The quote would later haunt Callahan, who began keeping a photo of the chalkboard on his desk as if it might whisper some secret he'd missed. Students described her as kind but private, devoted to her work, often staying late to grade papers or prepare materials. The school's janitor, Richard Klein, recalled seeing her car gone around 6:15 the previous evening, nothing unusual. She hadn't mentioned plans to anyone, and her answering machine held 2 messages, one from a colleague reminding her of a faculty meeting, another from her mother in Muskogee wishing her safety from the storms. The first official theory was structural collapse. Maybe she'd gone into the shelter, and it had somehow sealed itself, suffocating her. But the air vent had been functional the previous week. Carl Henson had helped her test it. And there was no body, no odor, no evidence of decomposition. Then came the theory of abduction. Maybe someone had locked her inside, removed her through another exit. But there was no secondary opening, no hidden tunnel. The shelter's foundation had been poured in 1978. Construction records were clear. Even ground-penetrating radar showed solid earth beneath. As the investigation dragged through the week, Bristow changed. The small town, accustomed to gossip about football scores and crop prices, became a place of whispers. People stopped using their storm shelters. Children crossed the street to avoid looking at Laura's house. News vans came and went, locals offered theories, and online forums grew obsessed. The term Bristow vanishing began circulating within days, spreading from local news to national tabloids. Callahan hated the coverage. It turned tragedy into spectacle, but he couldn't deny that the case had an element that defied ordinary explanation. On the 5th day, when the FBI arrived, he felt both relief and resentment. Agent Dana Correll, assigned from the Oklahoma City field office, approached the case with clinical detachment. She'd handled missing persons before, even some that seemed impossible at first glance. But when she stood inside the shelter, flashlight beam catching those faint chalk lines, she felt a shiver despite herself. She ordered soil analysis, luminol testing, and magnetic resonance scanning for hidden voids. Nothing. The space was as inert as a tomb. Yet every piece of evidence, every timeline, every witness statement, insisted Laura had gone inside and never come out. By the end of May, The official record listed her as missing, presumed deceased. Her parents held a memorial service in Muskogee, though no body was buried. Her students left flowers by the shelter door. Sheriff Hale closed the file reluctantly, though Callahan continued visiting the site, sitting by the open hatch at dusk, listening to the wind whistle through the vent pipe. Sometimes he thought he heard faint scratching below, but when he looked, the floor was always empty, polished, still bearing the faintest ghost of chalk. The Bristow vanishing faded from headlines as other tragedies claimed attention. Columbine, Y2K fears, the new millennium looming. But for those who'd known Laura, the absence remained a living wound. And somewhere beneath the quiet fields of Oklahoma, in a shelter cleaner than any crime scene had a right to be, a truth waited patiently for the storm to return. Detective Roger Callahan didn't believe in impossible crimes. He'd seen too many cases dressed in the costume of the supernatural that, under fluorescent light, turned out to be nothing more than human greed, rage, or error. But the shelter mocked logic. For weeks after Laura Jennings vanished, he found himself waking before dawn, driving the 8 miles from a sheriff's office to the small frame house at the edge of town, parking beside the rusted mailbox with a faded stenciled name Jennings, and sitting in silence with his thermos of coffee steaming on the dashboard while the early summer sun bled into the wheat fields. The shelter door remained locked again after the forensics team's final sweep, sealed with police tape that fluttered like warning flags in the wind. Every morning, Callahan stared at it, waiting for the world to blink and return something that had been stolen from it. By June, the investigation had devolved into paperwork and interviews that repeated the same information in slightly altered phrasing. Laura's colleagues insisted she'd been calm, focused, grading essays about Shakespearean tragedy. Her students remembered nothing strange. Her mother, Eleanor Jennings, called daily from Muskogee, her voice shrinking with each unanswered question. Callahan met her once at the sheriff's office. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that never stopped scanning the corners of the room. She brought a shoebox of photographs, Laura at 10 holding a spelling bee trophy, Laura at college graduation, Laura laughing beside her father in front of that same storm shelter years earlier. Eleanor laid them on the table as if the images could testify. When she spoke, her voice cracked not with grief but with disbelief. "She's in there, detective. I can feel it. You just haven't looked right." The autopsy of a place should have yielded something. Callahan ordered core samples drilled from the shelter walls and foundation, suspecting a hidden compartment. The concrete proved uniform, poured from a single batch in 1978. He studied blueprints, traced electrical wiring, even hired a retired structural engineer who'd helped build similar shelters across Creek County. The old man walked the perimeter with a metal rod, tapping, listening. After half an hour he shook his head. No voids. Solid as a tomb. That word stuck, tomb. The notion that Laura's disappearance was less an act of violence than a kind of burial haunted him. In July, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation sent a consultant from their Behavioral Analysis Division, a young profiler named Denise Parker whose sharp intelligence came wrapped in the dispassion of academia. She reviewed the case files, visited the scene, and spent 3 days cross-referencing similar incidents nationwide. Her report, delivered in a manila folder marked confidential, offered no comfort. This case presents an anomaly inconsistent with standard abduction patterns. No evidence of forced entry, sexual motivation, or opportunistic violence. Environmental conditions suggest deliberate staging or post-event contamination. In lay terms, someone had cleaned. But cleaned what? The chemical analysis from the floor residue remained the only tangible clue. Trace elements of ammonium chloride suggested industrial cleanser, but none of the local supply stores sold it in the concentrations found. Parker proposed that whoever staged the scene had access to maintenance-grade materials, possibly a janitorial or medical background. The detail echoed in Callahan's mind as he reviewed Laura's connections: teachers, students, maintenance staff, the janitor Richard Klein. Klein was 61, widowed, with an unremarkable record except for a 1983 drunk and disorderly charge. He'd been the last person to see Laura's car leaving the school. When questioned, he'd seemed genuinely confused, offering coffee-stained statements about grading papers and the smell of rain. His alibi, a night spent cleaning classrooms, checked out. Security footage confirmed his presence until nearly 7 p.m. Still, something about him lingered in Callahan's mind. Klein had keys to every door in the school. He had access to cleaning chemicals. And he lived alone in a small trailer outside of town, the kind of place where ghosts could breathe freely. On July 18th, Callahan visited unannounced. Klein greeted him in a sweat-stained undershirt, television blaring tornado footage from the spring storms. He seemed unsurprised to see the detective. "You still looking for her?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Callahan noticed the faint smell of ammonia in the air. Inside, the trailer was obsessively neat, the linoleum floor shining under harsh overhead light. A half-empty jug of cleaner sat by the sink. Callahan picked it up. The label read industrial-strength ammonium chloride solution. Do not inhale vapors. Klein explained he bought it from a supply depot in Tulsa years earlier, claimed he used it for stripping wax off floors. When asked about Laura, his expression softened. "She was one of the good ones. Used to bring me apple slices when I mopped after hours." Callahan pressed further. Did she ever confide in him? Seem scared? Klein shook his head slowly. "No, sir. But she asked strange things sometimes. Wanted to know how long someone could stay sealed in a shelter without fresh air. Said it was for a short story she was writing." Callahan wrote that detail in his notebook, a small spark in the darkness. The next week, he visited Laura's classroom again, searching through her desk drawers with the principal's permission. Beneath stacks of graded essays, he found a small leather-bound notebook filled with her handwriting, short fragments, sketches of dialogue, outlines for something she titled The Quiet Room. The entries described a teacher trapped underground, communicating through chalk symbols on the walls. Some entries blurred into first-person accounts, written in tense, shaky script. "The air grows thin but the silence is louder. I can hear the wind above me but it sounds wrong, like it's remembering something." Callahan closed the notebook, unsettled. The writing read less like fiction and more like transcription. He sent photocopies to Agent Correll at the FBI. Her reply, brief and typed, suggested psychological strain. Possible premeditated disappearance. Teacher exhibiting fixation on isolation and entrapment. Consider voluntary vanishing. The theory, that Laura had orchestrated her own disappearance, spread quickly among officials eager for closure. The idea fit the bureaucratic need for explanation, a woman overwhelmed by loneliness, staging an impossible mystery as an act of control. But it didn't fit the evidence. No secondary vehicle, no withdrawal of savings, no sign of preparation. Her life had been ordinary right up to the moment it ceased. By August, the shelter had become a local pilgrimage. Teenagers dared each other to touch the door at night. Paranormal investigators arrived with infrared cameras and digital recorders, claiming to capture whispers and electromagnetic spikes. The sheriff grew furious, posting no trespassing signs and assigning deputies to patrol. Still, people came. Some left flowers. Others chalked prayers on the concrete steps, tracing over the faint white patterns still visible on the floor. One morning, when Callahan arrived unannounced, he found a new symbol scrawled beside the hatch, a circle intersected by two vertical lines. It wasn't there the day before. He photographed it, then wiped it clean, though he couldn't say why. Summer faded into early autumn. The wheat fields turned gold, and the air carried the metallic tang of harvest. Callahan's obsession with the case cost him sleep, patience, and eventually his marriage. His wife packed her suitcase one evening while he sat at the kitchen table studying maps of Creek County, convinced the answer lay buried somewhere within a mile radius of that shelter. He barely noticed her leave. When he finally looked up, the only sound was the refrigerator hum and the ticking of the clock. He poured himself another cup of coffee gone cold. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, arrived not from forensics but from weather archives. In late September, a meteorologist from the National Severe Storms Laboratory visited Bristow to collect data from the May 3rd event. Over lunch, he mentioned something that froze Callahan mid-bite. "That storm cell split," the scientist said. "Two vortices. One passed east, the other looped back west. Oddest thing, we picked up a magnetic anomaly right over your town around 6:30 p.m. When Callahan asked what that meant, the man shrugged. Could have been equipment error. But for about 90 seconds, instruments recorded a spike like nothing we've seen. Compass needles reversed polarity. That night, Callahan drove to Laura's property under a sky clear and still. The fields shimmered with heat lightning in the distance. He parked beside the shelter, cut the police tape, and descended with a fresh flashlight. The air felt cooler underground, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something like static before a thunderclap. He crouched, running his hand along the floor. Smooth, cold, slightly tacky, as if cleaned recently. When his light swept across the far wall, he froze. A single chalk line, faint but unmistakable, curved upward in a shape like the letter J. He'd seen that handwriting before, in her notebook. He sat there until dawn, staring at that fragile white mark that shouldn't have been there, trying to decide if he'd lost his mind or if Laura Jennings was still somewhere close enough to write. The following weeks blurred into repetition. Reports to the state, follow-ups with the Bureau, the case slipping toward the limbo labeled inactive. Officially, there was no evidence of foul play, no body, no crime. Unofficially, the file sat on Callahan's desk long after others had been archived. Every night, he read her notebook again, tracing the loops of her handwriting. He memorized sentences that felt less like fiction and more like coordinates. The wind carries voices if you listen through the chalk. In October, on the first anniversary of the storm, a new family moved into Laura's house. Young couple, newborn baby, unaware of the history. They called the sheriff a week later, reporting strange noises from the backyard after midnight. When deputies arrived, they found the shelter door ajar, police tape gone. Inside, the air was perfectly still, floor spotless except for fresh chalk dust scattered near the wall where the letter J had been. The dust formed no pattern, only residue, like someone had wiped something away. Sheriff Hale ordered the shelter sealed permanently with welded steel plates. The county declared the property unsafe. But Callahan, even after transfer to Tulsa in 2001, never stopped returning in his mind to that underground room where the air hummed faintly and chalk turned into a language no one could read. Years later, in retirement, he would tell a younger detective that some cases never end, they just wait for the right storm. And when the Oklahoma winds rose again, rattling windows and bending trees, Callahan sometimes thought he could hear, beneath the sirens, the faint scrape of chalk on concrete. Spelling the name of the woman who'd vanished from a sealed shelter on a night the world itself seemed to lose its bearings. The shelter had been sealed for nearly 2 decades when the county finally approved its demolition. By then, the property at 418 Meadowlark Lane had changed hands twice, fallen into foreclosure, and been sold at auction to a man named Thomas Avery, a former contractor from Tulsa who saw opportunity where others saw superstition. He planned to level the land, build storage units, and sell the rest to an energy company installing cell towers. When the county inspector warned him about the welded plates covering the old tornado shelter, Avery laughed and said he'd seen worse. "If the thing's haunted, maybe I'll charge admission," he joked to his crew, a trio of young men who'd grown up hearing the Bristow vanishing whispered like a ghost story at slumber parties. They laughed too, though none of them wanted to be the first down the steps once the welding torch hissed and the steel began to glow orange. It was June 14, 2018, hot enough to make asphalt bubble. The field grass stood waist-high, cicadas screaming. The welds cracked easily under the acetylene torch, releasing a faint hiss of trapped air. Avery lifted the plate with the excavator's claw, set it aside, and peered down. The air that drifted up smelled faintly metallic, like rain on rust. He clicked on his flashlight and saw nothing but smooth concrete walls, bare floor, a single step coated in fine dust. "Looks clean," he called, and started down. The light beam caught movement, a flutter of white drifting lazily through the air. He reached out, thinking it was ash, but when it settled on his hand he saw it was chalk dust. The shelter's floor looked almost new, as if poured yesterday. In one corner, faint discolorations traced a pattern he couldn't quite discern. He bent closer, squinting, realizing they weren't stains but residue, fine white lines forming loops and intersecting curves. His foreman, standing at the hatch, called down, "Everything okay?" Avery didn't answer immediately. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. He turned in a slow circle, the beam cutting through dust motes. The far wall bore scratches, shallow, parallel, faintly curved. He lifted his hand to trace them and felt the smoothness of fresh etching, as if the marks had been made not years but minutes earlier. By evening, he was back in town, pale and shaking, insisting on finding someone from the original investigation. The sheriff's department connected him to Roger Callahan, retired since 2011, now living in Bartlesville. When Callahan answered, his voice carried the weight of time and cigarettes. Avery told him what he'd seen. There was a pause long enough to fill with static. Then Callahan said quietly, "You opened it, didn't you?" Avery admitted he had. "Seal it again," the detective said. "Whatever you do, don't go back down there tonight." But curiosity, like infection, spreads faster than warning. The next morning, one of Avery's crewmen, 24-year-old Ben Colson, showed up early, determined to prove the boss's fear was misplaced. He descended into the shelter with his phone flashlight on, filming for proof. The footage, recovered later from the phone found near the hatch, lasted 1 minute and 37 seconds. The first 30 seconds showed normal footage, concrete walls, the sound of Ben's breathing. Then, faint scraping, like chalk dragged slowly across stone. The camera jerked toward the sound. The beam caught a flash of motion, a white shape vanishing against the far wall. The video ended abruptly with static and a single frame of what appeared to be handwriting, cursive, slanted, 2 letters only, LJ. By the time Avery arrived at 8:30, Ben was gone. His phone lay on the top step, the flashlight still on. The shelter was empty. There were no footprints on the floor except Avery's from the previous day. The county police reopened the site, erected barriers, and filed a missing person report that sounded eerily familiar to anyone who'd been alive in Bristow in 1999. The local paper resurrected the old headline, "Bristow Vanishing Returns, Worker Disappears from Sealed Shelter." Detective Callahan drove down that afternoon. He hadn't set foot in Bristow for 15 years, but as his truck crested the hill overlooking Meadowlark Lane, memory hit like a migraine: yellow fields, sagging power lines, the smell of cut grass baking under the sun. The property looked unchanged except for the weeds taller than fences. The welded plate lay beside the hatch like a peeled scab. A deputy recognized him immediately. "Sir, they said you used to work this case." Callahan didn't answer, just descended the steps slowly, flashlight in one hand, old instincts returning like muscle memory. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have, as if insulated from the summer heat. His light swept across the walls and stopped on the scratches Avery had described. They were clearer now, deeper. Some crossed one another, forming faint shapes that might have been letters. He traced them with a gloved hand, whispering to himself. Laur. The rest of the name broke off into chaotic lines. Chalk residue dusted the floor in fresh drifts. When he looked up, the beam caught something wedged into a crack between wall and floor, a sliver of wood pale splintered at one end. He knelt and pulled it free. It was part of a pencil, bitten at the top, the brand barely visible, Bristow High School No. 2. He held it for a long moment, the past and present collapsing into the same silence. Outside, the sky darkened without warning. A line of storm clouds crawled in from the west, black against the horizon. Wind stirred the wheat fields, bending them in long synchronized waves. Callahan looked up, feeling the pressure drop, the barometric weight that every Oklahoman instinctively understands. Sirens began to wail somewhere downtown. Deputies yelled for everyone to clear the site. Callahan lingered a second longer at the hatch, eyes fixed on the floor below, where chalk dust began to swirl in small eddies as if stirred by unseen breath. That night, the storm tore through Bristow with terrifying precision. Power lines fell, a gas station roof ripped away, but the old Jennings property stood untouched once more. The next morning, when crews returned to assess damage, they found the hatch closed again, the lock snapped shut, a fresh coat of dust covering the steel plate. Callahan forced it open, heart pounding. The shelter was empty, but the pencil was gone. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Oklahoma. News outlets framed it as a bizarre echo of history: 2 disappearances, same location, 19 years apart. Conspiracy forums revived old theories: dimensional rift, government cover-up, ghostly revenge. The FBI declined to comment. Callahan, unofficially assisting the investigation, spent sleepless nights combing through Laura Jennings's notebook once more. He'd kept it all these years, tucked inside a filing cabinet under unpaid bills. The final entry, written in increasingly frantic scrawl, read, "If anyone finds this, tell them the door only opens for the storm." He dismissed it before as metaphor. Now he wasn't so sure. In August, he visited the county archives searching for land records, hoping to uncover something about the soil composition or underground utilities that might explain anomalies. A clerk handed him microfilm copies of property maps from the 1930s. Beneath what was now Meadowlark Lane, there had once been an oil survey shaft, capped in 1952 after a fatal cave-in. The shaft's coordinates overlapped almost perfectly with the shelter's foundation. Callahan requested geological surveys. The shaft had never been filled, only sealed with a concrete plug 30 feet down. He drove back to the property, stared at the ground, and felt the hair rise on his arms. If the plug had degraded, maybe there was an opening beneath the shelter. But that didn't explain the absence of debris, or the locked door, or how a grown man could vanish silently in seconds. He hired a private drilling company under the pretense of soil sampling. They brought ground-penetrating radar and a bore rig, setting up beside the hatch. The readings showed irregularities, small air pockets, a cavity extending beyond the shelter's footprint. When they lowered a fiber-optic camera through a narrow borehole, the monitor flickered, showing only static. Then for a brief second, an image formed, a wall covered in chalk lines, dozens of them, layered like overlapping handwriting. The feed cut to black, the camera cable snapping taut as if yanked from below. The operator cursed, reeling it up, finding the lens cracked, the cable sheath melted. Callahan stood motionless, heart hammering, the memory of that faint cursive J burning behind his eyes. The drilling crew refused to continue. By nightfall, they'd packed their equipment and left town. Callahan remained, sitting in his truck with the window down, listening to thunder rumbling far away. When lightning flashed, it illuminated the field in short bursts. Between flashes, he thought he saw movement, a figure near the shelter hatch, white against the darkness, bending as if writing on the ground. He stepped out, flashlight trembling, but when he reached the spot there was nothing but flattened grass and a faint smell of ozone. On the dirt, barely visible, someone had drawn a small circle intersected by two lines. He recognized it instantly, the same symbol he'd once wiped away in 1999. That night, back at the motel, Callahan dreamed of the shelter. In the dream, the door opened inward, revealing not concrete walls but a vast corridor lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Chalk lines covered every surface, overlapping until they became indecipherable. Somewhere in that endless corridor, he heard a voice calling his name, not with fear but with quiet familiarity. When he woke, his hands were coated in fine white dust. The official report on Ben Colson's disappearance concluded with the same phrase used 19 years earlier: no evidence of foul play. The county sealed the shelter again, this time pouring reinforced concrete over the hatch until it disappeared beneath the soil. But concrete ages, and Oklahoma's storms are patient. In Bristow, locals still claim that when thunder rolls low across the fields, you can hear a faint scratching from underground, steady and deliberate, like someone writing a name over and over, refusing to be forgotten. The county believed it had buried its problem when the concrete trucks left Meadowlark Lane in August 2018. They poured 4 feet of reinforced mix over the old hatch, smoothed it flat, and signed off the site as sealed forever. The paperwork labeled it non-hazardous obstruction, a bureaucratic way of saying don't ask questions. But history in Bristow had a habit of resurfacing when the weather turned. By spring 2020, torrential rains had washed away topsoil across Creek County, carving gullies and unearthing old foundations. The Jennings property, now abandoned after Thomas Avery sold it at a loss, became one of those scars, its field split open where the weight of the concrete slab had shifted. Beneath it, hairline fractures spiderwebbed through the poured seal, releasing a faint breath of cold air from whatever space lay below. The first person to notice was a surveyor named Angela Ward. She'd been contracted by the county to map drainage routes after the floods. On April 12 she parked her truck beside the field, stepped out into the wet grass, and saw a fine mist rising from a narrow crack near the slab's edge. Steam in April was unusual, and when she knelt to inspect, the smell hit her, not decay, not mold, but chalk and ammonia, sharp enough to sting her nose. She backed away, made a note in her log, and radioed the office. Possible chemical seepage, she said. Maybe an old septic leak. What she didn't mention was that as she leaned closer, she thought she'd heard something, a slow rhythmic sound, faint but unmistakable, like someone dragging stone across stone. By the time the county environmental team arrived 2 days later, the fissure had widened to nearly a foot. They lowered a thermal sensor and found the temperature below the slab a full 20 degrees cooler than the surface. The readings came back erratic, fluctuating as if something beneath were generating its own microclimate. One technician, a young intern from Oklahoma State, pointed out faint white markings along the edge of the crack, powder residue in curling lines. "Looks like writing," he said. His supervisor dismissed it as mineral leaching, but photographs taken that morning would later show what appeared to be cursive script, repeated 3 times, "Help me please." When word reached the sheriff's office, the reaction was swift and divided. Half the department wanted to ignore it, fearing another media circus. The other half wanted to excavate before the spring storms deepened the fissure. Sheriff Don Pearson, who'd taken over after Hale's retirement, authorized a limited inspection under controlled conditions. He also called one man he swore he'd never involve again, Roger Callahan. Callahan arrived that evening, older, slower, but still carrying the same worn leather notebook. The field looked smaller than he remembered, the grass shorter, but the air still carried that strange stillness, the hush that made even birds avoid the place. The concrete slab gleamed pale under floodlights, the crack running across it like a wound. Technicians had set up tripods and instruments, their voices hushed as if they were in a church. When Callahan crouched beside the fissure, he felt the temperature drop. The smell of chalk and disinfectant rose like memory. "You smell that?" he asked Pearson. The sheriff nodded grimly. "It's coming from below." They drilled a small core sample at the slab's center. The bit descended 20 inches before striking a hollow space. When they inserted a fiber-optic camera, the monitor flickered again, static, then darkness, then a brief glimpse of smooth concrete walls. Callahan leaned closer, heart hammering. For a fraction of a second, he saw a shape moving at the edge of the frame, pale and slow, tracing something on the wall with what looked like a hand. Then the feed cut out completely. The county halted the operation immediately, citing safety concerns. But Callahan refused to leave. He spent the night in his truck, parked at the edge of the field, the same way he had in 1999. Rain drummed against the windshield, and the air pulsed with distant thunder. Around 2 a.m., he saw light flicker under the slab, faint, bluish, intermittent, like lightning trapped underground. He stepped out into the rain, walked closer, and saw, through the widening crack, a glint of white dust swirling in the updraft. It rose in spirals, forming brief, flickering letters that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. He recognized one, J. The next morning, Pearson returned with state geologists. They declared the site unstable and ordered it fenced off, but that afternoon a reporter from Tulsa's Channel 6 ignored the warning tape and filmed a short segment standing directly on the slab. The footage aired that evening, complete with dramatic voiceover about Oklahoma's cursed storm shelter. Viewers noticed something the crew hadn't. At timestamp 042, while the reporter gestured toward the ground, faint chalk lines appeared behind her on the concrete, curling across the surface like veins. The image went viral. The next day the station received dozens of calls claiming the lines formed words, "I can't breathe." Within a week, Meadowlark Lane became a pilgrimage again. Ghost hunters, college students, conspiracy vloggers, they came in droves, climbing the fence to film themselves near the crack. Locals stayed away, muttering that the ground itself was sick. The sheriff assigned deputies to patrol, but people still came at night. On May 3rd, exactly 21 years after Laura Jennings vanished, a storm warning went out across Creek County. Sirens wailed at 6:17 p.m., the same minute as in 1999. Callahan watched from his motel window as the sky turned that unnatural green. Lightning rippled horizontally, and thunder rolled like heavy machinery. He dressed quickly, drove toward Meadowlark Lane through sheets of rain, his wipers barely keeping up. When he arrived, he saw headlights already there, 2 college kids filming themselves, laughing nervously. "Sir, it's fine," one shouted over the wind. "We're just getting B-roll." Callahan didn't answer. The siren screamed again, the wind roared, and the air changed, pressure dropping, electricity building until every hair on his arms stood on end. The kids ran as the first funnel touched down a mile west, tearing across the fields. Callahan dropped to his knees beside the slab, rain soaking his coat, shouting Laura's name into the storm. The wind whipped his words away. Lightning struck nearby, blinding him. When his vision cleared, he saw the crack had widened another inch, glowing faintly from within. Without thinking, he reached down, pressed his palm against the surface, and felt something pressing back, cold, human, deliberate. He jerked his hand away, stumbled backward, and fell hard into the mud. When he looked again, the glow was gone. The tornado veered north moments later, missing Bristow entirely. 2 days later, cleanup crews found something half buried in the mud near the slab, a small metal object, corroded but intact. It was a locket. Inside, beneath cracked glass, was a photo of Laura Jennings and her mother, taken at her college graduation. The edges were worn smooth, as if handled for years. No one could explain how it had survived underground or why it appeared after the storm. Laura Jennings, frail and confined to a nursing home in Muskogee, received the locket by courier. She held it in shaking hands and whispered, "She's still there." The state declared the field a restricted zone pending environmental study. Unofficially, they feared liability more than contamination. But Callahan continued visiting, driving the long miles from Bartlesville every few weeks. He'd park by the fence, notebook on his lap, recording changes, the smell, the temperature, the way the grass around the slab refused to grow. Sometimes, after storms, he found chalk dust along the fence posts, tiny loops like fingerprints of writing caught in the wind. He collected samples, sent them to labs under assumed names. Results always came back the same: calcium carbonate, trace magnesium, human skin cells embedded in the dust. By late autumn, his health had begun to fail. Years of cigarettes, sleepless nights, and obsession carved him thin. Yet even in hospital, hooked to oxygen, he kept talking about the shelter. Nurses humored him as he muttered theories about pressure fronts and electromagnetic resonance, about voices carried on frequency shifts. One night, when the rain hammered the windows and the power flickered, he pressed his call button and told the night nurse he heard chalk scraping beneath the floor. She smiled gently and told him it was just thunder. Callahan died on December 3, 2020, in his sleep. Among his belongings, nurses found a notebook filled with scrawled observations from his last months. The final entry read, "She isn't gone. The door opens when the sky remembers." The notebook was sealed in his personal effects, but a copy reached the sheriff's office through an anonymous delivery weeks later. Inside, taped to the last page, was a fragment of paper dusted white, with faint graphite impressions that, under magnification, formed the words, "Find the tunnel beneath the light." In early 2021, construction crews expanding Route 66 unearthed a concrete tunnel less than half a mile from Meadowlark Lane, running parallel to the highway, its existence unrecorded on any modern map. The tunnel appeared to have been part of a 1950 civil defense project, abandoned and forgotten. Inside, workers found chalk markings on the walls, thousands of overlapping lines, most illegible. At the tunnel's far end, near a rusted maintenance ladder, someone had written in careful script, "Tell them I tried to leave." No fingerprints, no human remains, no sign of recent activity. The discovery reignited national interest. Documentaries followed, experts debated, skeptics called it coincidence. But to the people of Bristow, no explanation mattered. They knew the siren still sounded every May, the storm still came, and the field on Meadowlark Lane still refused to stay buried. When the wind turns from the south and the clouds roll in, locals say you can see faint white lines drift through the air above that cracked slab, curling and dissolving like breath on cold glass. Some claim they spell a name. Others refuse to look at all. But everyone agrees on one thing: when the sky begins to hum and the smell of chalk rises from the ground, you go inside, you lock your doors, and you don't open them, no matter who you hear calling your name. The tunnel stretched for nearly a mile beneath Creek County, running like a buried scar parallel to the old Route 66, its purpose lost in bureaucratic amnesia. The state archives described it only as civil defense infrastructure, Project 52, built during the Cold War for population shelters that were never completed. But the chalk on the walls turned the structure from historical curiosity into evidence. Crews exploring the tunnel in March 2021 documented thousands of overlapping marks, curves, slanted letters, loops, layered so densely that the concrete looked like it had been tattooed by ghosts. There were words among the chaos, single sentences in precise cursive script: "The wind knows my name. He is above me. Open for the storm." The handwriting, analysts later confirmed, matched samples from Laura Jennings's lesson plans recovered in 1999. News spread quickly, and Bristow became a national fascination again. Documentaries descended, bringing drones, sound technicians, paranormal experts, and graduate students in equal measure. The county sheriff, exhausted by decades of speculation, permitted only limited access. Yet the more they tried to contain the story, the more it spread. Podcasts dissected every timeline conspiracy. Forums mapped magnetic anomalies along tornado paths, and a new theory emerged, that the Bristow vanishing wasn't unique. Across Oklahoma and neighboring states, at least 7 other cases from the 1970s through 2000 involved sealed shelters, locked rooms, or missing persons during storms. Each case, when plotted on a map, aligned along a single curved path sweeping from Texas through Kansas, a path meteorologists recognized as the most consistent tornado corridor in North America. Among those drawn back into the mystery was Denise Parker, the former behavioral analyst who had written the 1999 report calling Laura's case an anomaly inconsistent with standard abduction patterns. Now working as an independent researcher, she contacted the sheriff's office requesting access to the newly unearthed tunnel. Her credentials opened doors, and soon she was standing under flickering halogen lights, the scent of damp chalk heavy in the air. "It's like a message board," she murmured, brushing her fingers across the faint depressions. When she looked closer, she saw something chilling. Beneath the layers of writing were prints, dozens of them, small, delicate, unmistakably human handprints pressed into the concrete. Parker spent days photographing every inch of the tunnel, compiling notes, cross-referencing handwriting with known samples. What unsettled her most wasn't what she found, but what she felt, a low vibration in the walls, like distant machinery or thunder that never faded. The air pressure seemed to pulse. Once, while reviewing footage alone at the site, she heard a faint sound through her headphones, the rhythmic scrape of chalk, slow and deliberate. She froze, checking the timestamp. No one else had been in the tunnel at that hour. When she returned to her motel that night, a package waited for her at the front desk, no return address. Inside was a single item wrapped in brown paper, a cassette tape labeled Bristow 1999, Callahan Interview 2. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The sheriff's department had long assumed the tapes from that era were destroyed in a flood. She found a player, inserted the tape, and pressed play. Static filled the room, then Callahan's voice, tired and steady. Date June 21, 1999. Follow-up with Richard Klein, school custodian. A pause, then the soft scrape of a chair. Klein's voice, low and rough. "You don't understand, detective." She said it called to her. Said when the wind got still, she could hear it under the floor. Callahan, "What could she hear, Mr. Klein?" Silence. Then Klein again, whispering, her own voice, answering back. Parker replayed the tape 3 times, each repetition tightening the knot in her chest. She sent a digital copy to the Bureau's historical division, but the email bounced back with a confidentiality notice. 2 days later, she received a call from a blocked number. A calm male voice said, "Ms. Parker, we recommend you stop your independent investigation. Some structures are meant to stay buried." Then the line went dead. Instead of stopping, she dug deeper. Through public records, she discovered that Project 52 had been overseen by a now-defunct federal agency called the Civil Defense Research Unit, headquartered briefly in Norman, Oklahoma, before dissolving in 1964. Funding had come from both state emergency management and private contractors specializing in electromagnetic testing. The language in the contracts hinted at experimentation with low-frequency atmospheric resonance. Parker understood enough physics to realize what that meant. They'd been studying how sound and vibration behaved underground during storms. If their instruments had produced even minor resonance, they could have created standing waves, vibrations that echo indefinitely inside enclosed structures. In late April, she returned to the tunnel with a portable recorder and geophone sensors. She placed them along the walls, measuring frequencies inaudible to the human ear. 4 hours, the readings stayed flat. Then, at precisely 6:17 p.m., the same minute the 1999 sirens had first sounded, the sensor spiked. The waveform formed a pattern repeating at irregular intervals: 417, 1999, 417, 1999. The numbers flickered on her screen like coordinates. When she realized what she was seeing, she felt her throat tighten. 417 was the date of Laura Jennings's birth, April 17th. She tried to explain the data to the sheriff, but he dismissed it as interference. Undeterred, she drove to Muskogee to visit Eleanor Jennings, now 91, bedridden but lucid. Eleanor's eyes brightened when Parker mentioned her daughter. "She still talks to me," the old woman said. "When it rains. I keep chalk by my window." Parker thought it was metaphor until she noticed faint white lines drawn on the windowsill, loops and cursive shapes that shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. One phrase repeated 3 times, "under the second light." Parker returned to Bristow and compared notes. The newly discovered tunnel had 6 overhead fixtures spaced evenly. The second from the entrance hung slightly lower, its wiring corroded. She focused her search there, prying open the junction box embedded in the wall. Behind it, tucked into a small cavity, she found an envelope sealed in wax. Inside were 3 Polaroid photographs, grainy, overexposed, but clear enough to make out details. The first showed Laura Jennings standing beside the open shelter hatch, smiling, sunlight glinting off her hair. The second showed the same hatch closed, the steel lock in place. The third showed nothing but the empty field, yet faint white streaks ran across the frame like chalk marks caught midair. On the back of the third photo, someone had written, "When the sky hums, she listens." The discovery shattered Parker's composure. She contacted a journalist she trusted, planning to release the evidence publicly. But before she could meet him, her motel room was broken into. The photographs were gone, her laptop wiped clean. Only one thing remained on the wall mirror, drawn in white residue, a single letter J. She checked out the next morning without speaking to anyone and drove east out of Bristow, promising herself she'd never return. The official investigation into the tunnel ended that summer. The state filled the structure with foam sealant and poured concrete over every entrance, declaring it structurally compromised. All samples, notes, and recordings were transferred to a storage facility in Oklahoma City. But sealed things never stay silent for long. On May 3, 2022, the 23rd anniversary of the original disappearance, a violent supercell tore through Creek County again. It was the strongest since 1999, spawning 4 tornadoes that ripped across fields and highways. When it passed, Meadowlark Lane was again untouched, except for one anomaly: the new concrete over the old site had fractured cleanly down the center. In the aerial photos taken by storm chasers, the crack traced a shape eerily similar to a cursive L. 2 days later, a farmer 3 miles north discovered something half buried in his field after the floodwaters receded: a stack of old school papers, edges sealed by mud but legible. They were essays, graded in red pen. The top page bore the comment, "Excellent analysis, Laura Jennings." Beneath it, the faint imprint of another note in pencil, written backward as if pressed from below: "Tell Callahan the wind remembers." The sheriff's office retrieved the papers and locked them in evidence, but copies leaked online within hours. Forums exploded with theories: time loops, magnetic echoes, the dead communicating through storms. One user posted a comparison of seismic readings from every May 3 since 1999, showing consistent, unexplained pulses centered near Bristow. Meteorologists couldn't account for them. "It's like the ground breathes once a year," one researcher said. That summer, a documentary crew returned to film the Bristow vanishing, 23 years later. They interviewed surviving witnesses, analyzed the tunnel footage, and reconstructed Callahan's timeline. But during the final shoot, when they recorded nighttime audio near Meadowlark Lane, their microphones picked up a sound beneath the crickets and wind, a faint, rhythmic scraping, perfectly timed with each roll of distant thunder. The lead sound engineer isolated the frequency and amplified it. What emerged was unmistakable: a woman's voice, distant but clear, whispering one word over and over: "Open." The 24th anniversary storm began the same way as all the others, silently. The sky over Creek County turned an unearthly green-gray, the kind that made animals hide and made Oklahomans glance instinctively toward the west. Local radio broke into programming with the usual warning tone, and the weatherman, his voice a strained monotone, repeated the phrase that had become Bristow's unwanted anthem: "Seek shelter immediately." At 6:17 p.m., the first siren sounded. By then the property on Meadowlark Lane was nothing more than a fenced scar in the middle of waist-high grass. The county had posted new hazard signs: "No trespassing," "unstable ground," but the locals knew better. They called it the quiet field. People avoided it in daylight, crossed themselves when driving past it at night. Even children, who usually laughed at ghost stories, gave the place a wide berth. Yet one car rolled through the barricade that evening, its headlights cutting pale tunnels through the rising dust. Denise Parker had come back. For 2 years she'd kept her promise never to return, but the voices on her recordings had changed that. After the 2022 documentary, she'd been given a copy of the unedited sound file, the one the production team had refused to air. She had isolated the whisper, filtered it, reversed it, slowed it down. What she heard was not one voice but 2, layered together: a woman's soft plea beneath a man's rasping echo. The second voice said her own name. The storm sirens had drawn her like a summons. She parked at the edge of the field, wind whipping her coat, the smell of ozone sharp in the air. The slab of concrete glistened with rain. She approached it slowly, flashlight beam wavering. The old crack had widened again, a jagged seam almost a foot across. Warm air rose from below, breathing against her knees. She crouched, touched the edge. Fine white dust clung to her fingertips, chalk, impossibly dry despite the downpour. A flash of lightning illuminated the field, and for an instant she saw shapes in the rain, letters forming and dissolving, cursive lines written on air. She whispered "Laura," and felt the wind answer, a low hum that made her teeth ache. Then came the thunder, not as a crash but a deep, steady vibration pulsing through the ground. She set her recorder on the concrete, its red light blinking, and spoke into the storm. "If you can hear me, tell me where you are." The reply came as pressure rather than sound. The wind dropped, the air thickened, and every hair on her arms lifted. From the crack rose a faint blue glow, flickering like heat lightning. Beneath the rumble she heard the scrape of chalk again, slow, deliberate, spelling each letter. She leaned closer, her flashlight trembling. The words forming beneath the dust were not hers. "I am under the light." She turned toward the highway where the abandoned tunnel had once run. The second light, Eleanor's phrase, "under the second light." She knew what it meant now. The filled-in passage was only half a mile away. If there was still space beneath, it would connect directly beneath this field. She grabbed her recorder, sprinted toward the fence, and drove off through sheets of rain. At 6:41 p.m., the main funnel touched down west of town, a mile-wide column of rotating debris moving straight toward Route 66. Power lines snapped. Whole fields of wheat flattened. Parker's car fought the wind as she reached the service road that led to the old tunnel. The concrete barriers erected in 2021 had cracked open during the floods, leaving a narrow gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. Inside, the air was colder than the storm outside. Her flashlight cut through the dark, catching remnants of the old chalk that still clung to the walls. The vibration grew louder, rhythmic, like a heartbeat inside the earth. She followed it deeper, her boots splashing through shallow puddles until she reached the collapsed section where the second light fixture hung. The bulb, long dead, flickered once, an impossible flash in the dark, and went out again. Then she saw it, a circle of concrete at her feet, newer than the surrounding walls, its edges rough as if poured hastily. In the center lay a rusted inspection plate. She brushed away debris and saw faint words scratched into the surface, 417 to 1999. The vibration intensified, pulsing through her hands. The recorder on her belt began to hiss with static. She pressed her palms flat on the plate and whispered, "I hear you." The concrete beneath her shuddered once, then again. A crack split the center. A rush of cold air surged upward, carrying the unmistakable smell of chalk and lilac perfume. For an instant she thought she saw her, Laura Jennings or what might have been her, standing in the hollow below. The figure was translucent, its outline traced in white light, hair floating as if underwater. The eyes met hers with unbearable sadness. Then the wind roared through the tunnel, extinguishing the flashlight, and everything went black. When the storm passed, emergency crews found Parker's car abandoned at the service road entrance, headlights still on, driver's door open. The tunnel was flooded to the ceiling, the concrete barriers collapsed. It took 3 days for the water to recede enough to send a team inside. They found no body. Only the recorder, wedged in a crack near the second light. The audio recovered from that device became the most analyzed recording in Oklahoma history. For the first 5 minutes, only ambient noise, the hum of the storm above, the rhythmic vibration of distant thunder. Then faintly, a voice, Parker's whispering, "I hear you." Another voice overlaps, soft and strained, "Help me open it." The last 20 seconds are chaos, wind screaming, a low resonant tone that made speakers rattle, and then a single sentence clear and unmistakable, in 2 voices layered perfectly together, "The door remembers." The county sealed the tunnel again, this time filling it entirely with slurry and rebar, and declared the site permanently closed. But the data refused to rest. Geologists at the University of Oklahoma analyzing the waveform from Parker's recorder discovered something extraordinary. The final resonance contained frequencies too low for natural storms, matching precisely the hum produced by subterranean seismic vents. When mapped against Oklahoma's historical tornado tracks, those frequencies lined up along the same curved corridor as every major funnel for the last century. Meteorologists began to whisper what no one wanted to say aloud, that the land itself was tuned, that certain pockets of ground along the old civil defense route amplified atmospheric energy, vibrating in sympathy with storms. A closed chamber beneath the Bristow field might have acted like a resonant cavity, storing that energy, releasing it during weather events. But that didn't explain the voices, or the chalk, or how two people could disappear into sealed concrete. By 2023, the field was fenced again and patrolled by state troopers. Yet people still came during storm season, watching from the highway as lightning flickered above the ridge. They said the thunder sounded different there, hollow layered, like words swallowed by the wind. Some swore they saw brief flashes of white dust rising in spirals. In May 2024, a filmmaker obtained permission to record controlled audio tests near the site. He brought high-sensitivity microphones and a drone. For most of the evening, the recordings captured nothing unusual, just wind, rain, and the distant rumble of thunder. But as the storm peaked, one microphone spiked violently. The waveform formed letters, an impossible coincidence, tracing cursive loops that spelled a name, Laura. The drone camera, circling above, caught a faint glow seeping through the cracked slab in the field below, blue-white and steady. It lasted exactly 47 seconds, the same number of minutes Laura had been missing in 1999, before vanishing. The footage never aired. The filmmaker disappeared 2 weeks later while driving home from Bristow. His car was found on the shoulder of Highway 48, engine running, doors locked from the inside. On the passenger seat lay a piece of broken concrete covered in chalk dust and a note in neat cursive, "The storm keeps the door." Today, the Meadowlark Lane property lies behind a double fence, government-owned, listed as Environmental Study Zone. Locals say there are cameras now, though no one ever sees them move. On quiet nights, when thunder rolls low across the prairie, some claim the lights inside the fence flicker in patterns, short, long, short, like Morse code trying to tell a story too old to be heard. Laura Jennings passed away that same spring. In her bedside drawer, nurses found sticks of chalk wrapped in tissue and a scrap of notebook paper covered in faint graphite impressions. The handwriting matched her daughter's. The note read, "The door is not evil. It's lonely." Every May, the sirens still wail at 6:17 p.m. The townspeople still take cover, still whisper the same prayer. And when the wind pauses, just for a breath, somewhere beneath the layered earth of Creek County, the chalk begins to move again, tracing letters in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough to answer.